Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to dive into the story of Canopus, an Egyptian city that once stood at the mouth of the Nile and became famous across the Mediterranean world. It was a place of temples and healing, of wealth and trade, but also of indulgence and celebration. Ancient writers remembered it as a city of contrasts, where pilgrims came to seek cures from the gods, while others came to experience luxuries that bordered on excess. For centuries it thrived, until nature and time swallowed it. And for nearly 2,000 years this name survived only in fragments of text, like a rumour carried forward through history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying these explorations of forgotten history, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who loves ancient mysteries. It helps keep these stories alive and lets us keep uncovering more together. Canopus stood on the Canopic branch of the Nile, the westernmost mouth of the river. Today that branch is gone, silted over and lost to shifting geology, but in antiquity it carried ships from the delta into the Mediterranean. Just 25 kilometers east of Alexandria, the city sat in a natural position of importance. Goods arriving from inland Egypt could be loaded onto ships bound for Greece, Phoenicia, or Rome. Foreign merchants could disembark and follow canals that led deep into the country. Its role as a port alone would have guaranteed its prosperity, but this community offered more than trade. It was also a religious centre, tied to cults that reached far beyond Egypt's borders. One of its most famous sanctuaries was dedicated to Serapis, a god created in the Ptolemaic period who blended Egyptian and Greek elements. The temple to Serapis became a place of healing, where pilgrims slept within the sacred precinct, waiting for dreams that might cure their ailments. Ancient texts describe these visions as divine prescriptions, instructions for recovery. This reputation as a city of healing gave the settlement an aura that lasted for centuries, but alongside this sacred image was another one. Greek and Roman writers often spoke of the port as a place of pleasure, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with scorn. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, acknowledged its religious fame but described it as full of pleasure and revelry. Pliny the Elder echoed this idea, contrasting the town with Alexandria by saying that here banquets and music dominated. To more conservative moralists, the reputation became almost a warning. Yet this notoriety also made the Delta stronghold famous. People across the Mediterranean knew it as both a place of healing and a place of luxury. The settlement's mythological associations added another layer. One story claimed it was named after Canopus, the helmsman of Menelaus, king of Sparta, who had sailed back from Troy. According to the tale, the pilot died upon landing in Egypt, and a city rose where he was buried. Other traditions tied the port to Heracles, who was said to have brought Helen of Troy here during his travels. Myths like these made the sanctuary town not only a physical site, but also a symbolic one, a place where Greek and Egyptian traditions met, where legendary figures left their trace. During the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers governed Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, this coastal city became even more significant. The Ptolemies encouraged the cult of Serapis and organised processions from Alexandria to the Delta shrine in honour of the gods. Crowds would travel along the coast in sacred barges, carrying images of Osiris and Serapis in elaborate rituals that connected the two cities. These festivals were not only religious spectacles but also displays of wealth and political power. They tied the resort on Egypt's northern coast into the cultural fabric of the Ptolemaic state, making it a place where religion and politics intertwined. The Romans later left their mark as well. Wealthy officials and emperors built villas along the Canopic shore, attracted by the reputation of the resort. Inscriptions and ruins suggest that shrines and small temples were scattered along the coast, blending Egyptian deities with Roman styles. To elite Romans, this town offered both exoticism and relaxation. It was close enough to Alexandria to remain accessible, but far enough to provide escape. The combination of sacred and profane, healing and indulgence continued to attract visitors well into the imperial period. Behind these reputations, of course, was a working community. The port at the Canopic branch was part of the Delta's economic system, tied to agriculture, shipping and crafts. Its markets dealt in grain, wine, oil and papyrus, goods that Egypt exported in huge quantities. Fishermen worked the delta waters, artisans produced religious amulets for pilgrims, and shipwrights repaired vessels that crossed the Mediterranean. While ancient authors focused on its feasts or its healings, daily life here must have been as complex as any other Egyptian city. Children learned their letters, scribes wrote contracts, and traders haggled over prices, the routines that keep a city alive even as its fame grows. Even in antiquity, though, people seemed to sense a fragility. The Nile Delta was fertile but unstable, always shifting with the river's floods. Earthquakes occasionally shook the region, and the coastline was vulnerable to the sea. Writers who described the town often hinted at its temporary quality, as if they knew that such a place might not last forever. This tension between grandeur and transience adds another layer to its story. By late antiquity, in the centuries after Rome's dominance began to fade, the once famous port was remembered less for its daily life and more for what it symbolized. Christian writers often used it as a symbol of pagan excess, pointing to its feasts and rituals as examples of what the new faith had overcome. At the same time, its temples and shrines continued to draw the curious, lingering as reminders of an older world. In this way, the settlement became less a city and more an idea, a place of memory, story, and reputation. And this is the riddle we inherit. How does a city so widely known, praised and condemned by authors across the Mediterranean, vanish so completely that for nearly 2 millennia, it was nothing more than a name in old texts? How can a place that once hosted emperors, philosophers, and pilgrims leave behind so little that later generations doubted it ever existed at all? To stand at the site today, or rather above it, on the shore of Abu Qir Bay, is to feel that tension between presence and absence. Beneath the waters lie the remains, but for centuries no one could see them. For the ancient world, this northern sanctuary was a beacon, a port where the Nile met the sea, where healing dreams and evening banquets mingled. For the modern world, it became a mystery, a reminder that even the most celebrated places can sink into silence, and that is where the story truly begins. When we think about the great ruins of antiquity, most of them are visible. Pyramids in the desert, temples on hills, walls stretching across valleys. What makes the fate of this Nile Delta city so unusual is that it did not collapse into sand or stone. Instead, it slipped quietly beneath the sea. To understand how that happened, we have to look closely at the natural forces shaping the delta itself, a landscape that has never been as permanent as it appears on a map. The Nile Delta has always been alive, shifting and unpredictable. Each year the river flooded, carrying with it millions of tons of silt from the heart of Africa. That silt built the delta, but it also changed it constantly. Channels opened and closed, islands appeared and vanished, and sandbars moved like restless animals. The westernmost branch, the Canopus mouth, was once one of the busiest waterways in Egypt, but it demanded careful knowledge. Pilots had to read the river's moods, because one year's safe passage could be the next year's shallow trap. Cities along these shifting margins thrived because of the river's wealth, but they also lived with its risks. Beyond the constant drift of the Nile, the delta was vulnerable to the sea. The Mediterranean presses against Egypt's northern coast, and when storms rise, waves bite deep into the shoreline. Modern surveys of the region show that coastal erosion has been eating away at the delta for thousands of years. In antiquity, this meant that towns built near the edge always balanced prosperity against danger. A single storm could destroy harbours, and repeated flooding could undermine entire quarters. The port east of Alexandria, known for its sanctuaries and festivals, was no exception. Earthquakes added another layer of threat. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a series of fault lines, and tremors have been recorded since ancient times. Strabo, who visited Egypt around the turn of the 1st century BC, noted areas where the ground had subsided, leaving waterlogged ruins. Geological studies today confirm that the delta has suffered from seismic activity throughout history. When the earth shakes in a place built on soft silt and shifting sand, the results can be catastrophic. Land liquefies, foundations buckle, and entire districts can sink within hours. It is not hard to imagine how vulnerable a low-lying coastal settlement would have been when the ground itself betrayed it. Another factor was subsidence, the gradual sinking of the delta plain under its own weight. Over thousands of years, as new silt piled up, the older layers compressed and sank. This process is still measurable today, with parts of the northern delta sinking a few millimetres each year. Combine that slow motion with the natural rise of sea levels, and the equation becomes clear. Towns built close to the shoreline were always in a precarious position. A few centuries of stability could be undone by a handful of unlucky decades. The evidence of these forces can be seen in what archaeologists later discovered. Ruins in Abu Qir Bay, the area where this once famous sanctuary town now rests, show signs of sudden submergence. Whole blocks of stone are tilted at angles as if swallowed unevenly. Temples that once stood on firm ground now lie strewn across the seabed. Colossal statues carved to stand upright were found toppled, sometimes broken where they hit the earth before the waves claimed them. All of this suggests that natural disasters, whether earthquakes, floods, or a combination of both, played a decisive role in the city's fate. Historical sources hint at the danger, even if they never describe the exact moment of collapse. The geographer Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century AD, mapped the delta's mouths, but by his time the Canopic branch was already showing signs of decline. Later Byzantine texts mention coastal erosion and towns succumbing to the sea. By the Arab conquest in the 7th century, the Canopic Channel itself was silting up, making navigation difficult. A city that depended on its port could not survive long if the water that connected it to the world was closing. We should pause here and imagine what this meant on the ground. Picture the sanctuary town during its final centuries. Pilgrims still arriving, still seeking cures from Serapis. Banquets still filling courtyards with music. Roman villas perhaps still standing along the shore, their columns white in the sun. Yet beneath it all, the ground is shifting. Quays crack, streets flood, and fishermen notice that their moorings no longer hold where they used to. The sea creeps closer each year, and storms strike harder. Earth tremors shake statues from their pedestals. A generation might tell itself that the city is eternal, that gods protect it, but another generation would notice that temples once busy now stand in water up to their steps. By the 4th and 5th centuries AD, Christianity had spread through Egypt, transforming the delta's religious landscape. The old cults faded, and shrines dedicated to Serapis and Osiris fell quiet. Without the sacred processions and festivals that had once tied the settlement to Alexandria, its cultural importance declined. At the same time, the economy of the Nile Delta was shifting. New ports to the east and west drew more ships. Alexandria remained dominant, but smaller towns along the coast competed for trade. The once celebrated resort became only one option among many, and when natural disasters struck, its rivals were better positioned to recover. Archaeologists believe the final blow came between the 4th and 8th centuries AD, a wide window that suggests the city may have suffered in stages. Some parts may have collapsed suddenly during earthquakes. Others drowned gradually as the sea advanced. What is certain is that by the early Middle Ages, the great sanctuary town that had once hosted emperors, philosophers, and pilgrims was gone. Travellers no longer described it. Maps no longer marked it. Where processions had once carried gods in painted barges, only the waves moved. And yet the memory lingered. Strabo and Pliny continued to be copied in manuscripts. Later writers, unfamiliar with the geography, repeated their descriptions, unsure if the city was myth or history. To them it became something almost legendary, a cautionary tale about pleasure, or a story of a cursed port swallowed by divine judgment. By the time European travellers rediscovered Egypt centuries later, the name survived only in texts, disconnected from any living place. The disappearance of this northern sanctuary is not unique. The Delta holds many such stories, but it is remarkable because of how famous the city once was. To vanish so completely, despite its reputation, reminds us that the earth itself can rewrite history. What looks eternal in one century can be gone in the next, leaving behind only traces and questions. When a city slips beneath the water, it rarely disappears all at once. More often, it lingers as a presence in memory, half seen through the lens of myth. That was the fate of this Delta sanctuary. Though its stones vanished into the seabed, its reputation carried on, reshaped by generations who no longer knew where the ruins actually lay. The first layer of memory was mythological. For the Greeks, the port had already been tied to heroic stories. They believed its name came from Canopus, the helmsman of Menelaus, who had steered the Spartan king's ship on the long voyage home from Troy. According to legend, Canopus died upon reaching Egypt, and his burial place became a city. Others claimed that Heracles himself had passed through here, bringing Helen of Troy with him, leaving behind echoes of epic journeys. These stories turned the city into more than stone and mortar. It became part of the fabric of myth, a place where history blurred into legend. Later, when Christian authors described the coast, they recast the city in a different light. To them, the sanctuary was remembered less as a place of healing and more as a symbol of pagan indulgence. Its banquets and festivals became cautionary tales, examples of how people had strayed from piety into decadence. This transformation of reputation is striking. What had once been celebrated as a holy place was now condemned as a warning. The city itself was gone, but its memory had been reshaped to fit the moral narratives of a new age. The physical absence of the site only encouraged such reinterpretations. Travellers in the Byzantine and early Islamic periods did not see grand temples or villas on the Canopic coast. What they encountered were stretches of shoreline, often eroded and unstable, with occasional blocks of stone washed up by storms. These fragments were mysterious, disconnected from their original context. Without visible ruins, the city became more of a story than a reality. Its precise location slipped from maps, and only its name lingered in manuscripts. Over time, the gap between memory and reality grew wider. Copyists preserved Strabo, Pliny, and other classical sources, but few readers could picture where the city had stood. In medieval Europe, where knowledge of Greek and Roman geography was filtered through layers of translation, the references to the Canopic branch and its famous port were often misunderstood. Some thought the city was a mere legend, a symbol of Egypt's excesses rather than an actual place. Others confused it with Alexandria or with Herakleion, another drowned city of the Delta. By then, the original topography of the Delta had changed so much that even local inhabitants could not point to where the city once stood. This transformation into legend was not unique. Across the world, coastal communities that vanished were often reimagined as cursed cities, swallowed by the gods for their sins. In the Bay of Naples, people told stories of lost towns beneath the waves. In northern Europe, fishermen spoke of bells tolling under the sea from drowned churches. The fate of the Canopic port fit this broader pattern. To later generations, it was remembered less as a casualty of geology than as a moral lesson, a city undone by its own reputation for indulgence. The irony, of course, is that the city had once been as real and practical as any in Egypt. It had docks, warehouses, temples, and markets. It was a hub of trade and ritual. But because those physical structures vanished so thoroughly, what endured was only the reputation. This is why, for centuries, the story of the sanctuary town was told in the language of excess, healing, and myth, rather than in the language of stone and brick. Imagine a sailor in the early Middle Ages, navigating the shallow waters of Abu Qir Bay. Perhaps his net snagged on something heavy, a block of carved stone or a fragment of a column. To him, it would have been only debris, an obstacle from the deep. Without knowledge of the city's history, he would not have recognized the stone as part of a once famous temple. For the people of that time, the coast was simply coastline, without memory. The story of the drowned sanctuary was preserved not in lived experience but in the writings of scholars far from the shore. The silence that followed is striking. From roughly the 8th century until the 19th, there are almost no references to the port in historical records. Entire generations passed without knowing that beneath their feet and beneath the waves lay one of Egypt's most storied cities. This absence raises an unsettling thought. If a place as well known as this could vanish so completely, how many other cities might have been lost without leaving even a name behind? For nearly 2,000 years, the once famous sanctuary became little more than a ghost in texts. Pilgrims no longer travelled there, festivals ceased, ships no longer docked at its quays. The Serapis stood empty, then toppled, then drowned. Villas collapsed into silt. The harbour itself shifted as the Canopic branch of the Nile dried and closed. By the time Arab geographers described Egypt, the port was gone. All that remained was the story. Fragments of Greek geography, Roman history and Christian sermons, each reshaping the city in their own way. It is worth pausing here to reflect on how fragile memory can be. A city can dominate the imagination of one era and then vanish from the next. For the ancients, this northern port was a place of healing and revelry, visited by emperors and philosophers. For medieval scribes, it was little more than a moral anecdote or a half-remembered myth. For modern Europeans rediscovering Egypt in the 19th century, it was a puzzle, an ancient name without a visible location. This long silence is part of what makes its eventual rediscovery so powerful. The city did not merely disappear beneath water, it disappeared from human awareness. When we think of lost places, we often imagine ruins hidden under sand or jungle waiting to be uncovered. But the fate of this settlement was different. Its ruins were not just buried. They were erased from sight by the sea, cut off from land and memory alike. That is why, for almost 2 millennia, it existed only in imagination. To the world above the water, it had ceased to exist. To the world below, it waited. This is the haunting legacy of the city's disappearance. A place once filled with life, devotion, and indulgence reduced to silence. A name remembered, but a landscape forgotten. And in that silence, stories grew, of curses, of heroes, of divine judgment. They gave meaning to the absence, even as the real stones lay hidden beneath the waves. It would take centuries and the rise of underwater archaeology before the truth of the lost port would begin to surface again. As a city disappears into the sea, the memories of its witnesses are all that stay behind. For this northern delta port, some of the richest echoes come from classical writers who described it in ways both admiring and critical. Their words are fragments, snapshots of a place alive with temples, processions, and revelry. And together they form the closest thing we have to an ancient portrait. One of the earliest to mention the settlement was Herodotus, the Greek historian who travelled through Egypt in the 5th century BC. Herodotus had a talent for weaving geography, myth, and observation into stories that fascinated his readers. He wrote of the Canopus branch of the Nile, and while he did not linger long on the town itself, he knew of its role in Egypt's sacred landscape. In his accounts, Egypt was a country where gods walked close to men, and the delta's sanctuaries carried that intimacy. Later generations who read Herodotus would know that just beyond Alexandria lay a place where the river's edge opened into mystery. By the 1st century BC, Strabo, the geographer and philosopher, offered a clearer view. Strabo visited Egypt after the Roman conquest, and his description of the port is one of the most vivid. He noted its sanctuaries, its festivals, and above all its reputation for pleasure. "The place is full of pleasure and revelry," he wrote, capturing in a few words the balance between sacred devotion and indulgence that defined the city's image. For Strabo, the town was not just a port, it was a cultural marker, a place that symbolized Egypt's capacity for both ritual and excess. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, echoed this impression. In his natural history, he described the Canopus coast as a place famous for its banquets and indulgences, a foil to the intellectual atmosphere of nearby Alexandria. To Pliny and his Roman readers, the sanctuary town represented a kind of exotic decadence, attractive but also morally suspect. It is telling that writers so far from the Delta, men who were not natives of Egypt, carried forward this reputation. It shows how widely the city's name had travelled and how strongly its image had been shaped by outsiders. Yet not every visitor saw only indulgence. Philosophers and scholars also found their way to the city. Some accounts suggest that Greek thinkers visited its temples, curious about Egyptian rituals and wisdom traditions. The cult of Serapis, in particular, was designed to appeal to both Egyptian and Greek sensibilities. A visitor who entered the Serapeum might have seen priests in linen robes, statues that blended Egyptian iconography with Greek style, and rituals that spoke a language familiar to both worlds. To such observers, the city was more than a resort. It was a living experiment in cultural fusion. Myth added another layer to this image. As mentioned earlier, the name itself was linked to Canopus, the helmsman of Menelaus. To Greeks, this gave the port a heroic pedigree. It tied the delta coast to the world of Homer, making it part of the long shadow cast by the Trojan War. Another tradition linked the town to Heracles and Helen of Troy, suggesting that even the most famous figures of myth had left their traces there. These associations elevated the city beyond geography. It became a place where history and myth overlapped, where travellers could feel they were walking in the footsteps of heroes. The Osirian cult deepened this sense of connection. Each year, processions travelled from Alexandria to the shrine town, carrying sacred images of Osiris and other gods. These journeys by water were spectacles, with barges adorned in vivid colours, musicians playing and crowds following along the canals. For participants, the pilgrimage was both a religious duty and a celebration. For observers like Strabo, it was a striking display of Egypt's ritual life. The city's role as the destination of these processions ensured its place in the religious calendar, binding it to Alexandria in ways that reinforced both cities' prestige. Roman emperors later added their own presence. Villas along the Canopic coast became retreats for officials and elites. Archaeological finds, inscriptions, fragments of architecture, suggest that shrines and small temples multiplied in this period, blending Egyptian deities with Roman forms. To Rome's wealthy, the Delta resort offered relaxation, but also the allure of participating in traditions older than their empire. The image of a Roman governor or even an emperor walking among Egyptian priests at the Serapis would have symbolized the union of two worlds. What is fascinating in all these accounts is how reputation shaped reality. Writers like Strabo and Pliny emphasized the city's indulgence, and this emphasis echoed through centuries, long after the stones were gone. Christian authors later seized upon these same themes, portraying the sanctuary as a symbol of decadence that had rightly been swept away. Yet we must remember that these impressions were often selective. A working city always has more to it than what outsiders choose to notice. Behind the stories of feasts and rituals, there were workshops, markets, and neighbourhoods where ordinary people lived their lives. Fishermen casting nets in the delta waters, scribes recording transactions, children learning their letters in shaded courtyards. These scenes would have been just as real, though they rarely made it into the texts. Still, the literary record is invaluable because it preserves details that archaeology alone cannot. We know from Strabo that processions from Alexandria were central to the city's identity. We know from Pliny that its reputation for indulgence was already well established by the 1st century AD. We know from myths that Greeks had woven the port into their heroic narratives. These whispers from antiquity allow us to reconstruct not just the physical city, but also the way it was perceived. There is something haunting about this. The city survives in reputation even when its stones were lost. Ancient authors who wrote in passing about its sanctuaries or its festivals had no idea they were preserving the only surviving record of a place that would vanish beneath the waves. Their words became the bridge across centuries of silence, keeping the memory alive until divers and archaeologists could rediscover it in modern times. Without Strabo, Pliny, or the myths of Canopus the helmsman, we might not even know what we were searching for. It makes you wonder how many other places are lost because no one wrote about them. How many ports have slipped into the sea without leaving even a name behind? In this way, the sanctuary town is fortunate. Its reputation for pleasure, indulgence, and healing was strong enough to be recorded. And though those records were sometimes unflattering, they ensured that the city could never vanish completely. Its memory became a ghost that lingered in libraries, waiting for the moment when ruins would be found again. By the time the Roman Empire reached its height, the Delta Sanctuary still carried a powerful reputation. Travellers knew it as a place of healing, of indulgence, and of myth. Yet in the centuries that followed, its meaning began to shift. As new religions spread and political structures changed, the city that once thrived at the mouth of the Nile became less a physical place and more a symbol, one that reflected the broader story of Egypt's transformation. In the early centuries AD, the cult of Serapis remained central. Pilgrims still arrived in search of dreams and cures, sleeping in the temple precinct to receive visions from the god. The Serapis of the port continued to be a destination for those who hoped to mend broken bodies or troubled minds. Sacred processions from Alexandria to the shrine still filled the canals with music, banners, and hymns. For many, these rituals tied the two cities together, reinforcing their shared role as religious and cultural hubs of the Delta. But even then, cracks were appearing in the old order. Christianity had begun to spread across Egypt by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. and as it gained followers, the old gods faced increasing pressure. Christian authors, eager to contrast their new faith with the older traditions, often singled out the Canopic coast as an example of decadence. They repeated the descriptions of feasting and indulgence found in writers like Strabo and Pliny, but now they recast them as moral warnings. What had once been celebrated as a vibrant cultural scene was now portrayed as evidence of corruption. This change in interpretation reveals just how much reputation can outlast reality. By the 4th century AD, many temples across Egypt were already falling into disuse. The Serapis at Alexandria became the focus of bitter conflict between pagans and Christians, and eventually it was destroyed. The sanctuary town east of Alexandria, so closely linked to the cult of Serapis, could not escape the same fate. Even if its temple still stood for a time, their rituals gradually faded, replaced by churches and Christian shrines. The city's sacred identity dissolved, leaving behind only its reputation in texts. What is striking is how flexible that reputation was. In the hands of Greek geographers, the port had been a place of revelry and indulgence. In the writings of Roman authors, it became a resort for elites. In Christian sermons, it transformed again into a cautionary tale about the excesses of paganism. The physical city may have been the same, but its meaning changed depending on who told its story. By late antiquity, the shrine town was no longer seen as a thriving hub of trade or devotion. It was remembered more as a symbol of what Egypt had been and of what it had lost. At the same time, the broader context of Egypt was shifting. The Nile Delta, once the heart of Egypt's connection to the Mediterranean, was increasingly overshadowed by other regions. Alexandria remained a vital port and cultural centre, but the smaller towns along the coast began to fade from prominence. Political upheavals, invasions, changes in administration, and the slow fragmentation of Roman authority left many of these settlements vulnerable. The Canopic branch itself was silting up, reducing the navigability that had once sustained the port. Without its waterways, the city's economic lifeline was severed. By the 5th and 6th centuries, the settlement was already in decline. Archaeological evidence suggests that parts of the coast were submerged during this period, perhaps due to earthquakes or gradual subsidence. The combination of natural forces and political changes meant that the city was no longer the vibrant place described by Strabo or Pliny. And yet, in literature, its name lived on. Christian chroniclers continued to mention it, not as a living community but as a symbol of Egypt's pagan past. This symbolic role only grew as time passed. To later generations, the sanctuary town became part of the story of Egypt's fading glory under Rome and Byzantium. Once, it had hosted emperors, philosophers, and pilgrims. Once, it had stood as a beacon of ritual and celebration. Now, it served as a reminder that even the most celebrated cities could vanish. In this sense, its reputation as a place of indulgence became a metaphor for Egypt itself. Once powerful, now weakened, remembered more for its past than its present. What makes this transformation so compelling is the way it mirrors the broader fate of ancient Egypt. The old gods gave way to new faiths. The mighty temples fell silent. The Nile, which had sustained the land for millennia, shifted its branches and left once thriving ports stranded. In this context, the story of the Canopic sanctuary was not just about one city, but about the end of an era. Its disappearance symbolized the passing of Egypt from a land of pharaohs and rituals into a land reshaped by Christianity, Islam, and later empires. Writers of late antiquity may not have realized how literally the city would vanish. To them, it was already gone in a cultural sense, a relic of a pagan past condemned or dismissed. But in time, the earth itself confirmed the metaphor. Subsidence, storms, and rising seas swallowed the last of its stones. What had been condemned by preachers and moralists became inaccessible even to those who might have wished to preserve it. The symbol became reality, a city of memory, not of presence. And so, by the early Middle Ages, the port at the Canopic mouth was remembered only in fragments. To scholars, it was a reference in old manuscripts. To moralists, it was an example of excess. To locals, perhaps, it was a coastline dotted with broken stones, half visible at low tide. It was no longer a living city, but a ghost of reputation, a shadow cast across the centuries by writers who had once walked its streets. This is why the whispers from antiquity matter so much. They preserve not just the outlines of a vanished city, but also the way it was perceived, reshaped, and reinterpreted across time. The geographers, the moralists, the mythmakers, each added a layer to its identity. Without them, the city would have been not only physically lost but forgotten altogether. With them, it survived in memory, waiting for the day when its ruins would resurface. For nearly 2,000 years, the northern delta port existed only in memory. Ancient texts spoke of its sanctuaries and pleasures, Christian writers condemned its excesses, and geographers puzzled over its location. But no one had actually seen the city itself. Then, in the 19th century, as European explorers turned their attention to Egypt with fresh curiosity, the story of the drowned sanctuary returned to life. The early 1800s were a time of rediscovery. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt at the turn of the century had stirred fascination across Europe, producing illustrated volumes filled with sketches of temples, tombs, and inscriptions. The land of the pharaohs was no longer just a setting for biblical stories or classical myths. It had become a living field for science, archaeology, and adventure. Scholars and travellers wanted to match the places described by Herodotus and Strabo with real sites on the ground. That meant searching not just in the deserts, but also along the shifting edges of the Nile Delta. One challenge was that the delta itself had changed dramatically. Over the centuries, the river's branches had silted up, shifted, or disappeared entirely. The canopic mouth, once the busiest of them, was gone. By the 19th century, it was hard to even imagine where it had flowed. Maps showed only farmland and marshland stretching to the coast. If a great port had once stood there, its traces were hidden. But explorers were convinced that the classical authors had not simply invented it. The question was, where exactly had it been? Travellers began to collect stories from locals. Fishermen working off the coast near Abu Qir spoke of stones beneath the sea, places where nets would snag on blocks or columns. Some told of carved fragments dragged up from the seabed after storms. These accounts suggested that ruins might indeed lie underwater, close to the modern shoreline. But without diving equipment or sonar, confirming such rumours was nearly impossible. To 19th century scholars, the reports were tantalising, but they remained only hints. On land, researchers surveyed the delta coast, looking for ancient remains. Some found scattered blocks, fragments of statues, or reused stones in villages built from older material. These finds hinted that the coast had once been lined with substantial settlements, but distinguishing which ruins belonged to the lost sanctuary and which belonged to neighbouring towns like Heracleion was difficult. The geography of the delta had blurred too much, and the sea had taken too much away. Still, the idea of a drowned city captured imaginations. Writers began to speculate in print about whether the canopic port was truly gone, or whether it might yet be found. In 1850, the German scholar Heinrich Brugsch suggested that the ruins of the fabled settlement might lie offshore near Abu Qir. Later, travellers echoed this possibility. The coast became a focus for speculation. Somewhere beneath those shallow waters, they believed, lay temples, villas, and statues waiting to be revealed. The problem was technology. In the mid-19th century, underwater exploration was still in its infancy. Diving bells had existed for centuries, but they were clumsy and limited. The first practical diving suits with air hoses were only just appearing, and their use in archaeology was almost non-existent. The idea of systematically searching the seabed for ruins was decades away. So while scholars suspected that the canopic branch had swallowed its port, they had no way to prove it. Through the late 1800s, interest in Egypt remained focused on more visible sites. The pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, the temples of Luxor and Karnak. These monuments, towering above ground, offered dramatic finds and inscriptions that could be copied and studied. The drowned cities of the delta, by contrast, remained out of reach, their ruins hidden by mud, silt and waves. For most archaeologists, they were curiosities rather than priorities, yet the whispers persisted. Fishermen continued to haul up fragments. Locals spoke of submerged walls or sunken stones near the coast. Travellers recorded these reports in their journals, passing them on to European institutions. A few even speculated that the ruins of not just one, but several cities, including Heracleion, Maneuthis, and the Canopic Sanctuary, might all lie together beneath Abu Qir Bay. The mystery deepened. Had multiple ports vanished? Or were the accounts describing the same place under different names? By the early 20th century, the idea of a drowned delta was firmly lodged in scholarly debate. Archaeologists began to survey the coastline more carefully, noting changes in sea level, patterns of erosion, and the distribution of ancient canals. Geologists confirmed that the region was prone to subsidence, lending support to the theory that entire towns could have sunk below the surface. Still, without direct access to the seabed, the drowned sanctuary remained only a hypothesis. It is worth remembering how frustrating this must have been for early explorers. They had the words of Strabo and Pliny describing a lively port. They had local reports of ruins underwater, and they had geological evidence of shifting land. Yet they could not see the city itself. The sea guarded its secret. For scholars eager to match text with stone, this was a puzzle without a solution. At the same time, this absence kept the mystery alive. Because the ruins were inaccessible, the city became a story as much as a goal. It was the lost port of the Delta, a place that everyone agreed had existed but that no one could find. In this way, it joined a long list of legendary sites: Atlantis, Troy before Schliemann, or the cities of the Indus before their rediscovery. Its reality was never doubted, but its location remained elusive. The anticipation built slowly. By the mid-20th century, underwater archaeology was beginning to take shape. New diving technologies, sonar mapping, and magnetometers promised the ability to explore beneath the waves in ways that had once been impossible. For the drowned sanctuary, this meant that its long silence might finally be broken. Local fishermen had been right. There were stones beneath the sea. The question was no longer whether they existed, but how to reach them. And so, as the 20th century unfolded, scholars and explorers returned to Abu Qir Bay with new eyes. What had been rumour and speculation in the 19th century was now becoming a field of research. The drowned delta was waiting, and the search for the fabled sanctuary was about to begin in earnest. By the middle of the 20th century, whispers about ruins beneath Abu Qir Bay had grown harder to ignore. Too many nets had been snagged on carved stone. Too many storms had cast fragments of sculpture onto the beaches. Local fishermen spoke of entire stretches of seafloor where it seemed walls still stood, hidden beneath layers of sand and silt. What had been rumour in the 19th century was becoming a matter of serious speculation. The lost cities of the Canopic coast, including the sanctuary east of Alexandria, were out there, waiting for the right tools to reveal them. The challenge was that archaeology, until then, had been mostly a discipline of dry land. Scholars were trained to excavate tombs, temples, and ancient villages on stable ground. The idea of mounting an expedition underwater was daunting. Diving technology had improved during the World Wars, with better suits, air supplies, and even early sonar systems. But applying these tools to archaeology was new, expensive, and risky. Few institutions were ready to commit to such ventures. Still, some pioneers began to test the waters. In the 1930s and 1940s, Egyptian and European researchers surveyed the Abu Qir shoreline, noting concentrations of ancient blocks reused in modern villages. They suspected these stones had been dragged from offshore ruins after storms exposed them. The coastline itself seemed unstable, a reminder that the delta had been shifting for centuries. Reports suggested that the seabed nearby held something significant, perhaps the remains of the long-vanished port. The first serious underwater surveys of the bay began in the 1960s and 1970s. Teams equipped with diving gear and sonar attempted to map anomalies beneath the shallow waters. What they found confirmed what local fishermen had said for generations. The seabed was littered with structures. Divers reported large blocks aligned in straight lines, as if they were once walls or foundations. Sonar detected shapes consistent with harbours, canals, and even collapsed temples. Though these early studies lacked precision, they proved beyond doubt that ancient cities lay beneath Abu Qir Bay. At the time, scholars debated whether these ruins belonged to one city or several. Classical sources mentioned Canopus, Heracleion, also called Thonis by the Egyptians, and Meneuthis, all located somewhere along the same stretch of coast. The geography of the delta had changed so much that it was difficult to match names with sites. Were the scattered ruins fragments of one large metropolis? Or were they separate towns, each swallowed by the sea at different times? The question remained open. The discovery of submerged ships in the 1980s added weight to the mystery. Archaeologists retrieved timbers and hull fragments preserved in the silt. Some were Egyptian in design, others Hellenistic or Roman, suggesting centuries of activity in the drowned harbours. The presence of these ships indicated that the ports had not been minor settlements. They had been bustling hubs of international trade. The drowned sanctuary, once remembered only as a place of myth and indulgence, was now clearly recognised as a key node in the economic network of the Mediterranean. Technology was the key to advancing further. Magnetometers, which could detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field caused by buried stone or metal, offered a way to trace hidden ruins. Sonar mapping became more precise, capable of revealing outlines of streets, quays, and temples beneath the sediment. Underwater photography allowed divers to document structures without bringing them to the surface. These advances meant that by the late 20th century, the search for the Canopus coast's lost cities was no longer guesswork. It was becoming a science. And yet, progress was slow. The seabed of Abu Qir Bay was treacherous. Layers of silt, sometimes several meters thick, buried the ruins. Visibility was poor, often only a few feet in front of a diver's mask. Currents shifted the sand constantly, hiding and revealing structures in an endless cycle. Excavating in such conditions required patience and funding, both of which were in short supply. For decades, the bay was explored in fits and starts, each expedition adding fragments to the puzzle, but leaving the overall picture incomplete. Meanwhile, anticipation grew among scholars and the public alike. The idea of entire cities resting intact beneath the sea was irresistible. Journalists began to write about Egypt's Atlantis, a phrase that captured imaginations but also risked sensationalizing the work. For archaeologists, the real challenge was not to invent legends, but to carefully reconstruct history. They wanted to prove that the accounts of Herodotus, Strabo, and Pliny were rooted in reality, that the temples and villas described by ancient writers had indeed stood on the Canopic shore. The 1980s and early 1990s brought fresh momentum. International collaborations, better equipment, and a growing interest in maritime archaeology set the stage for a breakthrough. Surveys of the bay revealed anomalies too regular to be natural, alignments of stone blocks, circular foundations, and rectangular enclosures that matched the footprints of temples. It became clear that the drowned ruins were extensive, covering large areas of the seabed. Local memory also played a role. Fishermen continued to share stories of nets catching on colossal statues or carved columns. After storms, villagers sometimes found pieces of stone washed ashore, weathered but still recognizable as ancient. These finds reinforced the sense that an enormous archaeological treasure lay just beyond reach. The sea, which had hidden the cities for centuries, was also slowly giving them back piece by piece. By the early 1990s, anticipation was at its peak. Scholars were convinced that beneath Abu Qir Bay lay not just one city, but several, including the long-lost sanctuary of Canopus. The challenge was to mount a systematic, large-scale exploration that could map, excavate, and document the ruins with precision. What was needed was someone with the vision, resources, and persistence to carry the project forward. That figure was about to arrive in the form of Frank Gaudio, whose name would soon become synonymous with the rediscovery of Egypt's drowned cities. At the threshold of this new chapter, it is worth pausing to consider the long arc of the search. For centuries, the sanctuary had been a ghost, preserved only in texts. In the 19th century, it returned as a rumour, glimpsed in fragments hauled from the sea. In the 20th century, technology transformed those whispers into evidence, revealing harbours, temples, and ships beneath the waves. By the 1990s, the lost city was no longer a legend. It was an archaeological reality, waiting to be brought into the light. By the 1990s, the mystery of the Canopus coast had lingered for more than a century. Scholars knew there were ruins beneath Abu Qir Bay. Sonar had detected structures, divers had glimpsed massive blocks, and fishermen had long spoken of statues hidden below the waves. What was missing was a systematic effort, someone willing to dedicate years, even decades, to unravelling the puzzle. That figure emerged in the form of Frank Gaudio, a French underwater archaeologist whose work would transform speculation into discovery. Gaudio had already built a reputation for meticulous underwater research. Unlike treasure hunters, who often stripped wrecks for profit, he was committed to archaeology in its truest sense, uncovering the past carefully, documenting it, and preserving it for study. In 1987, he founded the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, known as the EASM, to pursue large-scale projects with both scientific rigour and public impact. His background was unusual. Trained in mathematics and statistics, he had worked as an economic advisor before turning to archaeology. This analytical mindset, combined with an explorer's persistence, made him uniquely suited to tackle the drowned cities of Egypt. When Gaudio turned his attention to Abu Qir Bay in the early 1990s, he entered a landscape of half-answered questions. Were the ruins the remains of Canopus, or Heracleon, or Menuthis, or all three? The bay was known to hold ancient settlements, but no one had mapped them fully. With the backing of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities and support from sponsors, Gaudio launched a series of expeditions that would chart the seabed in unprecedented detail. The work began with technology. Gaudio's team employed advanced sonar and magnetometers, dragging instruments slowly across the bay to detect anomalies beneath the silt. They created precise maps, showing where stone walls, canals and harbours might lie hidden. Once targets were identified, divers descended to investigate, often working in near darkness with only a few feet of visibility. Layer by layer, they began to peel back the mud and reveal the outlines of ancient cities. The first spectacular discoveries came in the mid-1990s. Divers uncovered colossal statues lying toppled on the seabed, figures of pharaohs and gods carved from granite, some more than 16 feet tall. One statue depicted the god Hapi, the personification of the Nile's flooding, with his rounded belly and muscular form. Another showed a Ptolemaic ruler, dressed in the style of both a pharaoh and a Greek monarch, embodying the cultural fusion that had defined the region. These statues had once stood before temples, commanding the gaze of pilgrims and traders. Now they lay silent beneath the waves, coated in silt, but remarkably well preserved. The impact was immediate. Photographs of divers swimming alongside colossal statues made headlines around the world. The lost cities of Egypt were no longer a matter of rumour. They were real, and they were breathtaking. For the first time in centuries, the sanctuary town at the Canopus branch was visible again, not as myth, but as stone. Temples soon followed. Excavations revealed the outlines of massive structures, their foundations still intact despite centuries underwater. Inscriptions identified them as sanctuaries dedicated to Osiris, Isis, and Serapis, confirming what classical writers had described. Here were the very temples where pilgrims had once sought healing, where sacred processions had ended, where myths had been retold in stone and ritual. To see them emerge from the mud was to see antiquity restored. The finds were not limited to monuments. Gaudio's team also uncovered smaller artifacts that told stories of daily life. Coins stamped with the profiles of Ptolemaic rulers, jewellery made of gold and precious stones, amulets dedicated to the gods. These items had fallen into the harbour or been offered at shrines, and the sea had preserved them with astonishing clarity. Each object was a fragment of a life once lived in the drowned port. Ships added another dimension. Dozens of ancient vessels were discovered buried in the silt, preserved by the low oxygen environment. Some were Egyptian barges used in religious processions, others were trading ships carrying goods across the Mediterranean. Timber beams, anchors and cargo were found in place, offering a rare glimpse into ancient seafaring. The harbour of the sanctuary town was no longer just a name in texts. It was a living port, now frozen beneath the sea. By the late 1990s, the scale of the discoveries had become clear. Abu Qir Bay did not hold fragments of a single city, but the remains of several, including Heracleon, also known as Thonis, and Canopus itself. The challenge of separating them remained, but the evidence for their existence was overwhelming. Gaudio's maps revealed entire street grids, canals and harbours, urban landscapes stretching across the seabed. It was as if time had stopped at the moment of submergence, preserving a whole world beneath the waves. The rediscovery of Canopus was particularly striking. For centuries, the city had been remembered only as a place of myth, indulgence, and condemnation. Now, statues of pharaohs, blocks of temples, and coins bearing its name proved its reality beyond doubt. The sanctuary at the Canopus mouth was not a ghost or a symbol. It had been a thriving metropolis, one that had left behind stone evidence even stronger than the words of Strabo or Pliny. The news spread quickly. Exhibitions of artifacts toured Europe and Asia, allowing the public to see the rediscovered treasures firsthand. Visitors gazed at colossal statues, delicately inscribed stele, and everyday objects that had lain hidden for nearly 2 millennia. For many, it was the first time they realized that Egypt's lost cities were not only real but accessible, that the sea, like the desert, could preserve history. For archaeologists, the implications were immense. The discoveries forced a rethinking of the delta's history. Scholars had long known that the Nile's branches shifted, but the scale of the submergence at Abu Qir Bay showed just how unstable the region had been. It also revealed how central these ports were to Egypt's interaction with the wider Mediterranean. Heracleion and Canopus had not been minor towns. They had been gateways for trade, religion, and culture. Their disappearance had left a gap not only in Egypt's geography but in its history. And yet, as spectacular as the finds were, they were only the beginning. By the end of the 1990s, Godio's team had mapped vast areas of ruins, but much remained buried. Each season of excavation revealed new surprises. Statues rising from the mud, inscriptions confirming names, artifacts that illuminated forgotten rituals. The lost city was returning piece by piece as divers and archaeologists carefully uncovered its story. For the first time since antiquity, the world could see Canopus not through myth or moral tales, but through its own stones. The sanctuary town that had vanished beneath the sea was rising again, its voice restored after 2,000 years of silence. By the early 2000s, Frank Godio's work in Abu Qir Bay had already changed how the world thought about Egypt's delta. What had once been dismissed as rumour was now mapped, photographed, and brought to the surface. But the story was far from finished. Each season of excavation expanded the picture, showing that the drowned Canopic coast had been more complex, more vibrant, and more influential than anyone had imagined. One of the breakthroughs came with the discovery of monumental gateways, or pylons, that had once marked the entrances to temples. These stone blocks, some weighing several tons, lay toppled in the mud but still carried inscriptions. They revealed the names of rulers who had sponsored the temples, Ptolemaic kings eager to link themselves to Egyptian tradition. For scholars, these inscriptions were a gift, connecting the submerged ruins directly to the chronology of known dynasties. Suddenly, the city was not just an anonymous ruin. It had names, dates, and patrons, tying it firmly into the larger history of Egypt. Smaller finds added texture to the story. Hundreds of bronze coins were recovered, stamped with the faces of pharaohs, Ptolemaic queens, and Roman emperors. Gold jewellery gleamed after centuries beneath the sea, its delicate craftsmanship almost untouched by time. Pottery shards told of everyday meals, while votive offerings revealed the prayers of pilgrims. Each artifact was a voice from the past, whispering about the lives once lived in the drowned port. Among the most remarkable discoveries were ceremonial boats. These were not ordinary vessels, but sacred barges used in processions of the gods. Carved timbers, anchors, and fittings were found buried in the silt, preserved in astonishing condition. Some carried traces of paint, hints of the brilliant colours that had once dazzled onlookers as the barges glided along canals. To see these remains was to glimpse the very vessels that had carried images of Osiris and Serapis from Alexandria to the sanctuary town during great festivals. The processions described by ancient writers were no longer just words on a page. They had left their imprint in wood and rope. As the excavations expanded, archaeologists realized that the cityscape beneath the waves was immense. Streets stretched in regular grids. Quays lined harbours wide enough to hold dozens of ships. Warehouses stood where goods had once been stored, grain, wine, oil, and incense bound for the Mediterranean. Temples occupied central places, surrounded by courtyards and processional routes. Villas and smaller shrines dotted the outskirts. It was not a minor outpost, but a thriving metropolis, a place that matched Alexandria in scale, if not in fame. Public exhibitions of the finds brought global attention. In 2005, treasures from the excavations went on display in Paris, later travelling to Berlin, London, and Tokyo. Millions of visitors gazed at colossal statues of pharaohs, delicate jewellery, and massive stone blocks lifted from the sea. The exhibitions made clear that what had been rediscovered was not only a local curiosity, but a world-class archaeological site. People left with the sense that Egypt still held surprises, that its history was not exhausted, but still capable of astonishing revelation. For scholars, the discoveries forced a re-evaluation of Egypt's role in the Mediterranean. The drowned Canopic coast showed how deeply Egypt had been tied into networks of trade, religion, and culture. Goods flowed through its harbours not only to Greece and Rome, but also to the wider world. The Levant, Cyprus, even as far as Spain and India. Religions too flowed outward. The cult of Serapis, born in Egypt, spread across the Mediterranean, eventually reaching Rome itself. The rediscovered temples of Canopus helped explain how that spread began, grounding the cult in stone foundations that had been hidden for centuries. Work continued steadily through the 2000s. Each year, Godio's team returned to Abu Qir Bay, mapping new areas, excavating deeper layers, and conserving fragile artifacts. Advances in 3D mapping allowed archaeologists to recreate the entire cityscape digitally, showing how streets, harbours, and temples had once looked. These reconstructions brought the drowned city to life, allowing scholars, and the public, to walk virtually through a port that had been lost for nearly 2 millennia. By the early 2020s, the scale of the discoveries had reached a tipping point. Enough had been mapped, excavated, and reconstructed that scholars could confidently say they understood the city's full extent. Harbours, temples, and residential quarters had all been identified. The outlines of the metropolis stretched across several square kilometres of seabed. It was larger and more complex than even the most optimistic scholars had guessed. Then came the moment of confirmation. In 2025, new surveys using the latest high-resolution sonar and magnetometry revealed the last missing pieces of the puzzle. Previously uncharted zones of the bay showed the continuation of streets and walls, linking previously separate sites into a single whole. What had seemed like scattered ruins were now connected into one vast urban landscape. For the first time, archaeologists could see the drowned city in its entirety, a port frozen in time beneath the waves. The announcement made headlines around the world. After centuries of speculation, decades of exploration, and countless dives, the lost sanctuary of Canopus was no longer just a name. Its full scale was visible, mapped, and understood. The temples where pilgrims had sought healing, the harbours where ships had docked, the villas where elites had dined, all had been rediscovered. The city that had vanished for nearly 2,000 years had returned. For Egypt, the rediscovery was a triumph. It showed that the country's past still held secrets capable of reshaping history. For archaeology, it was a milestone, proving the power of underwater methods to reveal entire cities long thought lost. And for the world, it was a reminder of how fragile civilization can be. A city once known across the Mediterranean had vanished beneath the waves, leaving only whispers in texts. Now, after patient work and modern technology, it had risen again, not as a living community, but as a treasure of memory and stone. The rediscovery of Canopus was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. Scholars now had the task of interpreting what the ruins meant, for Egypt, for the Mediterranean, and for our understanding of how civilizations thrive and fall. The city had returned from silence, and its voice was strong. The rediscovery of the Canopic coast was more than a triumph of mapping and measurement. What made it truly extraordinary was the wealth of material that emerged from the mud. Temples that had once drawn pilgrims from across the Mediterranean, colossal statues toppled but intact, and countless objects that offered glimpses of daily and sacred life. These finds transformed the city from an abstract legend into a place we could imagine walking through, filled with sound, ritual, and trade. At the heart of the drowned city stood its sanctuaries. Among the most striking was the Serapeum, dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. Classical sources had long associated the port with this cult, but to see the temple's stones emerge from the seabed confirmed the texts in dramatic fashion. Massive foundations outlined the complex, while fragments of columns, doorways, and altars gave a sense of its scale. Inscriptions identified Serapis as the central deity, blending Egyptian and Greek iconography in a way that mirrored the city itself. Pilgrims who once entered this space would have encountered a god who spoke to both traditions, a divine figure meant to bridge cultures. Nearby lay other sanctuaries dedicated to Osiris and Isis. The cult of Osiris was deeply tied to the delta, and the drowned port had been a key site in the god's annual festivals. Archaeologists uncovered chapels and processional ways that likely formed part of the ritual route described by ancient authors. In these ceremonies, barges carrying the image of Osiris travelled from Alexandria to the Canopus coast, accompanied by priests, musicians, and crowds of devotees. The discovery of boat remains and ceremonial fittings near the temples confirmed that this was more than literary invention. It had been a living ritual performed on these very waters. Colossal statues stood guard at the temple entrances. One of the most famous is the granite figure of Hapi, the Nile god, discovered lying on the seabed in remarkable condition. Over 16 feet tall, the statue depicts the river's abundance through the god's rounded form, symbolizing fertility and prosperity. Another statue represented a Ptolemaic ruler, possibly Ptolemy II, depicted in pharaonic style yet with Greek features, a visual declaration of the fusion that defined the period. These statues once towered over pilgrims and visitors, embodying both divine power and royal authority. To swim beside them today is to experience a kind of time travel, an encounter with the scale of the ancient imagination. The sanctuaries also yielded smaller but equally revealing objects. Hundreds of bronze and terracotta votive figures were found, left as offerings by pilgrims seeking healing or divine favour. Some depict Osiris, others Isis, still others Serapis. Each one represents a personal story, a prayer for recovery, gratitude for a cure, or a plea for protection. Together, they speak of the thousands who once travelled to the port not for trade or pleasure but for hope. The city's harbours produced another category of treasures. Divers uncovered anchors, rigging, and the remains of ships preserved in silt. These vessels, some ceremonial and others commercial, revealed the range of activity that filled the city's waterways. The ceremonial barges were richly decorated, carrying the gods in festivals. The trading ships bore amphorae of wine, oil and grain, evidence of the goods that passed through the port on their way to the wider Mediterranean. The harbour was not just a functional space, but a stage where economy and ritual overlapped, with sacred processions and cargo ships moving side by side. One of the most remarkable finds was a collection of gold jewellery, discovered in what had been a temple treasury. Necklaces, rings, and amulets lay scattered in the mud, their brilliance undimmed after centuries. Some pieces carried inscriptions invoking the gods, while others displayed Greek motifs like Eros and Nike. The combination of Egyptian and Greek elements reflected the city's hybrid identity, a place where cultures mingled as easily as goods. These treasures were not only symbols of wealth, but also offerings, expressions of devotion and identity. Coins provided another layer of evidence. Thousands were recovered, stamped with the profiles of Ptolemaic kings, Roman emperors, and local rulers. The variety of coinage revealed the city's role in international trade. Merchants from across the Mediterranean brought their currencies, and the port absorbed them all. To hold a coin from Canopus is to hold a piece of its connectivity, a reminder that this was a place where economies met as surely as rivers and seas. Inscriptions and stelae offered direct voices from the past. Some recorded decrees, dedicating temples or recording donations from rulers. Others commemorated festivals or victories. One stela confirmed the role of the city in Assyrian processions, linking the archaeological finds to the texts of classical authors. These inscriptions were more than records. They were anchors of identity, tying the city's monuments to specific historical moments. The religious life of the port was inseparable from its role as a centre of healing. Archaeologists found evidence of incubation rituals, where the sick slept in sanctuaries awaiting dreams that would guide their recovery. Small votive limbs made of terracotta, arms, legs, eyes, were among the offerings, left by those who hoped the gods would cure specific ailments. These finds humanized the city's reputation as a place of healing. Behind the grand statues and monumental temples were individuals seeking relief from pain, trusting in divine intervention. What emerges from all these discoveries is a portrait of a city that was both sacred and practical, both luxurious and everyday. It was a place where colossal statues stood alongside humble offerings, where gold jewellery gleamed next to terracotta figurines, where sacred barges sailed alongside grain ships. The fusion of Egyptian and Greek styles, seen in everything from temple inscriptions to jewellery motifs, reflected the city's identity as a cultural crossroads. These treasures also challenged the stereotypes handed down by ancient writers. Strabo and Pliny emphasised the city's indulgence, its revelries, and excesses. Christian authors later portrayed it as a symbol of pagan decadence, but the archaeology shows something richer. The drowned port was indeed a place of luxury, but it was also a place of devotion, healing, and everyday life. Its people prayed, traded, celebrated, and suffered. They built monuments to gods, but they also cooked meals, raised children, and counted coins. The rediscovery of their world restores the complexity that earlier reputations had flattened. By the time the first wave of discoveries was complete, scholars had enough evidence to say with certainty, this was not just a fabled resort. It was a city of temples, treasures, and gods, a metropolis where the rhythms of economy and religion intertwined. The sanctuary town was more than myth. It was a lived reality, preserved in stone, wood, and gold beneath the waves. As excavations pressed deeper into Abu Qir Bay, archaeologists realised that the significance of the finds went far beyond statues and temples. What emerged was a picture of a city that served as a hinge between worlds, Egyptian and Greek, sacred and profane, everyday and extraordinary. The artefacts lifted from the seabed did more than illustrate ancient texts. They rewrote our understanding of how this community functioned in its final centuries. One of the clearest patterns was cultural fusion. The city had been founded in Egypt, but under the Ptolemies it absorbed Greek influences that shaped its architecture, religion, and even its jewellery. Temples followed Egyptian plans with pylons and processional routes, but inscriptions often included Greek dedications. Statues of rulers wore pharaonic crowns while carved with Hellenistic features. In a gold pendant dredged from the seabed, Isis appears with Greek-style curls. In a bronze figurine, Serapis carries both Egyptian attributes and a Greek beard. These details reveal how the people of the port lived comfortably in two traditions, blending them rather than choosing between them. The city's economic role also became clearer. Storage jars and amphorae pulled from the harbour told of a vast trade network. Some bore stamps from Rhodes, Cyprus, and the Levant. Others carried markings that linked them to vineyards in the Aegean or olive groves in North Africa. Egyptian grain, loaded upriver, was the city's greatest export, but wine and oil flowed in from abroad. This exchange of goods paralleled the exchange of ideas. The sanctuary town was not an isolated outpost but a marketplace of cultures. Religious life remained at the centre. Excavations revealed ritual basins, offering tables, and sacred pools where devotees may have purified themselves before entering temples. Inscriptions confirmed the role of annual festivals, especially those dedicated to Osiris. One text described how the god's image was carried by boat into the city amid music and chanting. Archaeologists even found traces of harbour installations that may have served as docking points for these sacred barges. To imagine the procession is to see the city alive with sound and movement, its canals crowded with pilgrims eager to glimpse the god's arrival. Evidence of healing cults also multiplied. Dozens of terracotta models of body parts were found near the Serapeum, legs, eyes, and even internal organs. These votives represented the ailments of the donors, offered in hopes of divine cure. The practice was widespread across the ancient Mediterranean, but here it confirmed the city's role as a place of incubation and healing. Alongside these, archaeologists discovered inscriptions thanking Serapis for recovery, tangible proof that the sanctuary had been a centre of hope for the sick. Daily life emerged in smaller finds. Pottery fragments showed patterns of diet. Fish from the delta's lagoons, bread from Nile grain, fruit preserved in jars. Lamps decorated with both Egyptian and Greek motifs suggested households that blended traditions as naturally as they blended foods. Tools for weaving, fishing weights, and gaming pieces hinted at ordinary rhythms. Women spinning thread, men casting nets, families gathering to play. Even in a city famed for luxury and sanctuaries, life pulsed with the same modest routines found in any town. Some discoveries were more unexpected. In one area, archaeologists uncovered a cluster of shipwrecks preserved together. Their proximity suggested a sudden disaster, perhaps a storm or an earthquake that capsized them in the harbour. The ships carried cargoes of grain and wine, alongside ritual objects. The mix spoke of the city's dual role as both a commercial hub and a ritual destination. In one wreck, divers found a bronze statuette of Osiris tucked among amphorae, as if economy and devotion had sailed hand in hand. What gave these finds extra weight was how well the sea had preserved them. Unlike ruins on land, exposed to erosion and looting, the mud of Abu Qir Bay sealed artefacts in place. Timber remained intact, colours lingered on walls, and delicate jewellery survived untarnished. For archaeologists, it was as if the city had been frozen at the moment of its fall. Every excavation season felt like stepping back into a living community. The broader significance of these finds soon became clear. They challenged the narrow image passed down by ancient writers who emphasised only indulgence. The sanctuary town was indeed a place of luxury, but it was also a place of work, devotion and resilience. Its temples anchored ritual life, its harbours fueled trade, and its households lived in a world that was both Egyptian and Greek. The rediscovery expanded our understanding from stereotype to complexity. Scholars also noted how the finds illuminated the decline of the old gods. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, Christianity was rising across Egypt. The sanctuaries of Osiris and Serapis still functioned, but the votive offerings dwindled. Coins from later centuries showed crosses alongside older symbols. The drowned city captured this transitional moment, a society still clinging to ancient rituals, even as new faiths reshaped the empire. The ruins thus spoke not only of grandeur but of transformation, a culture caught between continuity and change. The treasures also forced archaeologists to reconsider the relationship between Alexandria and the Canopus coast. Ancient texts had described festivals linking the two, but the artifacts confirmed how closely they were tied. Alexandria may have been the political and intellectual capital, but the sanctuary town had been its spiritual partner, hosting rituals that reinforced the identity of the delta. To lose it beneath the sea was not just the loss of a port, it was the loss of a counterpart to Alexandria itself. By the time the rediscovery was announced in 2025, scholars could say with confidence that the drowned port had been more than a myth of indulgence. It had been a sacred centre, a trading hub, a place of healing, and a cultural crossroads. The colossal statues and gold jewellery captured headlines, but the terracotta votives, pottery shards, and coins were equally important. Together they told a story of human complexity, of devotion, ambition, suffering, and celebration. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the finds was the sense of interruption. Everything recovered from Abu Qir Bay spoke of lives suddenly halted. Temples with their statues still standing, ships with their cargo still packed, offerings still lying at shrines, all suggested a city stopped mid-breath. The sea had not erased it gradually, it had frozen it. For archaeologists, this made the site uniquely powerful. They were not just reconstructing ruins, but recovering a moment in time, a world caught at the edge of survival and loss. The portrait of the city is vivid. This was a place where gods and merchants shared the same harbours, where healing rituals coexisted with feasts, where cultures blended in stone and jewellery. The treasures retrieved from the sea were not simply beautiful, they were keys to understanding how a community at the edge of the Nile Delta lived, worshipped and connected with the wider world. And in their rediscovery, the drowned city spoke again, not as myth but as history restored. In 2025, when surveys confirmed the full extent of the drowned city east of Alexandria, the announcement resonated far beyond the world of archaeology. It was not just the technical triumph of mapping harbours and temples beneath the waves, but the symbolic return of a place that had been absent for nearly 2 millennia. A city that classical authors once celebrated, a city later dismissed as myth or condemned as decadence, had re-emerged with undeniable clarity. For Egypt, this was a rediscovery that carried both pride and humility. Pride because the country could once again point to a heritage richer than what was already known. Not only pyramids and desert temples, but entire cities lying intact beneath the sea. Humility because the fate of the Canopus coast reminded everyone that even the mightiest places can vanish. Civilizations rise along rivers, build monuments of stone, and weave reputations that echo across continents, yet a shift in the earth or a surge of the sea can erase them in a matter of years. The return of the drowned sanctuary brought a sense of balance to history. For centuries, the city's reputation had been frozen in text, defined by the words of Strabo, Pliny, and later Christian writers. It was remembered as a place of revelry, indulgence, or superstition. Now, the stones themselves spoke. Temples, statues, coins, and votives offered a fuller picture, one of devotion, trade, healing, and resilience. The rediscovery corrected the record, reminding us that no city is one-dimensional. For archaeologists, the site became a living laboratory. Each discovery answered questions but raised new ones. How exactly did the sacred processions unfold? Which rulers commissioned the temples? How did merchants from Rhodes, Cyprus, or Rome experience the port? The finds offered tantalizing clues, but not final answers. This open-endedness was part of the allure. The drowned city became a reminder that history is not a closed book but an ongoing conversation, where new voices emerge with every excavation. The global response to the rediscovery revealed something deeper about our relationship to the past. Millions of people who had never heard the name of the Canopus branch before were suddenly captivated. News articles, documentaries, and exhibitions framed the site as a sunken world, a phrase that struck a chord. It suggested that beneath the seas lie not just wrecks and debris but entire civilizations waiting. The idea that a city of such fame could vanish so thoroughly made people wonder, how much else has been lost? For Egyptians themselves, the site added another chapter to a heritage already central to identity. The pyramids speak of eternity, Luxor speaks of grandeur, but Abu Qir Bay speaks of fragility. To stand on the shoreline knowing that beneath the waves lies a metropolis once equal in fame to Alexandria is to feel both pride and caution. It is a story of resilience, but also a reminder of vulnerability. The Earth is never as fixed as we believe. The rediscovery also fed into a larger narrative about climate and change. As seas rise in the modern world, the story of a drowned ancient city resonates with new urgency. Archaeologists studying the Canopus coast were not only documenting the past, but offering a mirror to the present. If storms and subsidence could erase a city in antiquity, what might happen in the centuries ahead? The drowned sanctuary became both a treasure of history and a warning for the future. Exhibitions after 2025 highlighted this dual message. Visitors marveled at colossal statues of pharaohs and gods, but they also learned about the geology that had swallowed the city. Maps showed how the coastline shifted, how the Nile's branches changed, how subsidence pulled land beneath the sea. The story was not only about glory and loss, but about the constant dialogue between human ambition and natural forces. It invited reflection on the precariousness of our own cities, built on coasts and deltas around the world. The return of the drowned port also reframed the story of Alexandria. For centuries, Alexandria has been remembered as the crown jewel of the Delta, with its famous library, lighthouse, and cosmopolitan culture. But the rediscovery showed that Alexandria was not alone. Just to its east stood another metropolis, equally vibrant, hosting festivals and trade that complemented the great city's role. To imagine Alexandria without its partner on the Canopus coast is to miss half the picture. Together, the two cities formed a pair, one intellectual and political, the other ritual and spiritual. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the rediscovery was the human scale. Coins and statues speak of rulers and gods, but terracotta votives and simple pottery speak of ordinary lives. A clay model of a leg left in a temple tells us of someone limping with pain, hoping for healing. A child's toy found in the silt speaks of families who lived on the waterfront. A lamp decorated with both Egyptian and Greek motifs tells of evenings when cultures blended over shared meals. These details remind us that the drowned city was not only a stage for emperors and priests, but also a home for thousands of unnamed people. In this way, the rediscovery brought the city back to life in more than one sense. It was no longer just an archaeological site, but a community remembered. Every artifact pulled from the seabed reattached a name, a story, or a gesture to a place that had been silent for centuries. To see these items in museums, gleaming after their long burial, was to bridge time, to recognize ourselves in the fears, hopes, and celebrations of people long gone. What makes the rediscovery especially powerful is its completeness. Unlike ruins on land, plundered or weathered for centuries, the city beneath Abu Qir Bay was preserved almost intact. Streets, temples, ships, and statues lay frozen in the mud. It was not just fragments, but an entire world, a snapshot of life before disaster struck. To rediscover it was to walk into a moment, to see a city just as it had been when the sea claimed it. That immediacy gave the story its emotional weight. The confirmation in 2025 was not the end of the story but a new beginning. Archaeologists will spend decades studying the finds, reconstructing rituals and tracing trade networks. But for the wider world, the rediscovery already carries meaning. That history is never truly lost, only hidden. A city once remembered only in rumour has rejoined the map, reminding us that the past still has surprises to give. Standing on the shoreline at Abu Qir Bay today, the waves look unremarkable. Fishing boats drift across the water, gulls circle overhead, and the coast hums with the routines of modern life. Nothing on the surface reveals that just below lies an entire city, frozen in silence for nearly 2 millennia. Yet in 2025, that silence was broken. The rediscovery of the drowned port was not only about bringing artifacts to light, it was about reintroducing a forgotten community to the world's memory. For those who walked through the exhibitions of colossal statues, delicate jewellery and votive offerings, the effect was profound. Visitors found themselves face to face with the people of a vanished city, their hopes, their rituals, their trade, their daily lives. To see a terracotta model of a leg placed in a healing temple was to feel the vulnerability of someone long gone, trusting a god to mend their body. To stand before the granite figure of Hapi was to sense how deeply the Nile's rhythms shaped the lives of those who worshipped him. The rediscovery blurred the line between past and present, turning myth into tangible reality. At the same time, the city's return reminded us of fragility. Civilizations often imagine themselves eternal, but the drowned sanctuary proved otherwise. Here was a metropolis known across the Mediterranean, praised and condemned by classical writers, tied to the great festivals of Egypt, and yet it vanished almost overnight. The forces that erased it were not armies or invaders, but the quiet persistence of geology and sea. The earth shifted, the waters rose, and the city was gone. Its fate is a lesson about the vulnerability of even the most celebrated places. For historians, the rediscovery filled a gap. Texts had preserved the city's reputation, but not its reality. Archaeology restored the missing half, showing that behind the indulgence described by Strabo and Pliny lay a community of complexity and depth. It was a place of ritual, devotion, and work, as much as of pleasure. By uniting the literary with the material, the rediscovery gave the city its voice back. No longer reduced to stereotype, it returned as a living place, inhabited by real people with real struggles and joys. For the wider world, the city's re-emergence stirred imagination about what else might lie hidden. If a port once so famous could vanish for nearly 2,000 years, what other cities may be sleeping beneath seas and lakes? Already we know of others: Heraklion nearby, Pavlopetri in Greece, Dwarka in India, Port Royal in Jamaica. But surely there are more, unrecorded, waiting. The drowned sanctuary became a symbol not just of Egypt's past, but of the global reality that our coasts have always shifted and our monuments have always been vulnerable. This sense of mystery is what makes the rediscovery resonate. Archaeology often gives us answers, dates, names, reconstructions. But here, it also gave us questions. What other histories have slipped from memory? How many stories have been lost not because they were unimportant, but because the earth simply changed beneath them? The city at the Canopus branch shows us that forgetting is not always neglect. Sometimes it is the natural result of living on a restless planet. There is also something hopeful in the city's return. Lost for centuries, it was never truly gone, only hidden. Its stones waited beneath the waves until technology, persistence, and curiosity uncovered them. This is a reminder that history does not vanish. It only waits to be found. The drowned port teaches us patience, that the past has layers still to reveal, and that discovery is always possible. The symbolism of its resurrection extends beyond archaeology. In an age when seas are rising again, the story of a drowned ancient city feels like a mirror. Just as storms and subsidence erased it long ago, our own coastlines today face change. To study the fate of the Canopic coast is to confront the reality that the balance between land and sea is always fragile. But it also reminds us of resilience. The city may have drowned, but its memory and meaning survived. Its rediscovery is a story of endurance, not just of loss. In the end, what the rediscovery gives us is perspective. We see that history is never linear, that civilizations do not simply rise and fall, but shift, vanish, and sometimes re-emerge. The drowned sanctuary rejoined the conversation of the present after nearly 2 millennia of absence. Its return tells us that silence is not the end of the story, but only a pause. And so, after thousands of years, the city rises again, not as a living community, but as a reminder that history is never truly lost, only hidden. Beneath the waves, whole worlds may still be waiting, their temples, ships, and markets preserved in silence. The rediscovery of the Canopic coast is not just about one city, but about the vastness of what remains unseen. The shoreline at Abu Qir is quiet now, but in that quiet there is depth. Somewhere below, colossal statues still rest in the mud, coins still gleam faintly in the dark, and streets still lie where they once carried pilgrims and traders. The city does not live again in the way it once did, but it speaks, and in its voice we hear both warning and wonder. After 2,000 years, the drowned sanctuary has returned, not as myth, not as a symbol of indulgence, but as a reminder that civilizations can vanish and yet be found again. It asks us to look at our own world with humility, to recognize the fragility of what we build, and to accept that history is far larger than we can see at any one time. That awareness is perhaps the greatest treasure its rediscovery has given us. Thank you for watching.